The night was shrouded in darkness when Sarah, a young university student, arrived at the train station. The rain fell incessantly, creating a gloomy backdrop for their evening journey home. The station, normally bustling during the day, was almost empty, with just a few passengers waiting for the last train of the day. Sarah had spent the day in town visiting family, but was now eager to return to her routine at home. She took her ticket and waited patiently on the cold, damp platform. The sound of the approaching train echoed through the station, and the yellow lights of the vehicle's headlights appeared around the bend in the track. The train stopped with a gentle jolt, and the doors opened to welcome the few passengers who were boarding. Sarah found an open seat in one of the nearly deserted carriages and settled in with her backpack beside her. The train began to move slowly, gaining speed as it left the station behind. The sound of the engine was a constant murmur that filled the carriage, and the rain tapped the windows with a melancholy cadence. The night outside was so dark that Sarah could barely see beyond the window. The night landscape passed quickly, becoming just a succession of blurs. She tried to distract herself with a book she had brought with her, but the feeling of loneliness bothered her. As time passed, a strange feeling began to settle in. Sarah felt like she wasn't alone in the carriage, even though most of the seats around her were empty. She looked around, trying to identify the source of her uneasiness, but saw nothing out of the ordinary. However, the feeling that someone or something was watching her persisted. It was as if invisible eyes were staring at her, making her skin crawl. Sarah turned her attention to the book again, but now she read without really taking in the words. It was then that she began to hear indistinct whispers, so soft they were barely audible. The whispers seemed to be coming from somewhere nearby, but she couldn't determine the source. They were unintelligible words, as if someone were whispering secrets that shouldn't be heard. Sarah tensed, her eyes darting across the empty seats around her. She couldn't identify where the whispers were coming from, but they disturbed her deeply. With every second, the murmurs became more audible, as if they were getting closer. She tried to ignore the growing sense of fear, telling herself that she was imagining things. Maybe it was just the normal train noises, or maybe it was her tiredness after a long day. However, the whispers continued, uninterrupted, as if they were getting closer to their source. Sarah's anxiety increased, and she looked around, hoping to find an explanation for the whispers. The other passengers were asleep in their seats, apparently oblivious to what was happening. None of them seemed to notice the disturbing sounds that tormented her. Sarah felt increasingly isolated and vulnerable, surrounded by the unknown and inexplicable whispers. Her heart pounded as the darkness of the night advanced outside the window and the whispers intensified in her mind. She knew something was wrong, something that couldn't be easily explained. As time passed, the situation on board the train became increasingly strange for Sarah. The whispers, once just an indistinct murmur, now seemed clearer and more defined. She could make out unsettling words and phrases, but she still couldn't identify the source of the whispers. Sarah looked around the carriage, desperately trying to find the source of the sound. However, all the passengers were still asleep, or at least appeared to be. It was as if she was the only one who noticed the disturbing whispers that surrounded her. The whispers began to take shape, and Sarah could hear phrases like "you're not alone and we're here." The words were whispered in a chilling manner, as if they were being whispered directly into her ear. She felt a chill run down her spine. She decided to get up and check the other cars for answers. As she walked down the narrow, dark hallway, whispers followed her. It was as if they were inside her mind, a hissing voice that haunted her. Entering one of the neighboring cars, Sarah was shocked to see that it was completely empty. There were no other passengers there, just rows of empty, untidy seats. The feeling of loneliness and oppression grew even more. She continued her search for the other cars, but they were all the same, empty and silent. It was as if she were alone on board that train, except for the whispers that accompanied her. She began to question her own sanity, wondering if she was hallucinating. Determined to find an answer, Sarah returned to the carriage in which he had boarded. The feeling that someone or something was watching her persisted, but she couldn't identify the source of the whispers. It was then that she noticed a shadowy figure emerging from one of the carriage doors. Her heart leapt in terror when she saw the tall, slender figure emerging from the shadows. The figure was dressed in old, tattered clothing, its face hidden in shadow. Her steps were dragged, making an ominous sound on the floor of the carriage. Sarah wanted to scream, but her voice was stuck in her throat. The shadowy figure was slowly approaching, its invisible eyes fixed on Sarah. She felt an icy presence envelop her, and fear completely overcame her. Her muscles were unresponsive, and she was paralyzed with terror. The figure reached out towards Sarah, and she felt an oppressive pressure in her chest. She was about to be swallowed by darkness when suddenly the train lights came on, and the figure disappeared. Sarah was panting and shaking, her body tense with the terror she had just faced. She looked around the carriage, but now everything was as it should be. The other passengers were still asleep, and the train continued on its way normally. She had no idea what had happened, whether that shadowy figure was real or a figment of her frightened imagination. She tried to wake up the passengers around her, hoping to find some answer, but they all looked at her with confused looks, as if they didn't know what she was talking about. Sarah knew she needed to find out what was happening on the train and who or what that shadowy figure was. But for now, she was alone in her bewilderment, with fear still echoing in her mind. Sarah remained seated in her seat, unable to forget her terrifying encounter with the shadowy figure in the train carriage. The lights were on again, and the other passengers continued to sleep or read their books, completely oblivious to what had just happened. She knew she couldn't stand by and simply ignore what she had experienced. The ominous whispers still echoed in her mind, and the shadowy figure continued to haunt her thoughts. It was as if something supernatural and inexplicable was happening, something she couldn't just ignore. Sarah stood up with determination and decided that she needed answers. She began making her way through the narrow corridors of the train, determined to investigate every detail for clues as to what was happening. The whispers still accompanied her, whispering unintelligible words that disturbed her deeply. She noticed that all the train cars were empty, except for the central car, where she had had her encounter with the shadowy figure. Every time she approached this carriage, the feeling of fear and apprehension enveloped her again. She knew this was where she should look for answers. Sarah entered the center car cautiously, her eyes scanning the space for clues. She found no one, just the same empty, untidy seats. It was as if the carriage was empty, but she knew something was wrong. It was then that her eyes fixed on a broken mirror hanging on the wall. The distorted reflection showed a shadowy figure standing behind her, his features obscured by shadows. A shiver ran down Sarah's spine, and she quickly turned around, but there was no one there. The broken mirror was the only indication of the shadowy figure's presence. Sarah approached him and examined the jagged shards of glass. She wondered if the mirror was somehow linked to the terrifying manifestation that had haunted her during the trip. Before she could investigate further, she heard footsteps approaching from the hallway. The whispers also intensified, as if they were warning her of some imminent danger. Sarah glanced at the carriage door, fearing what she might find. The shadowy figure was there again, emerging from the shadows of the door. His empty eyes fixed on Sarah, and his icy presence filled the carriage. She was paralyzed by fear, unable to move or scream. But this time, something was different. The shadowy figure did not approach her in a threatening way. Instead, she seemed to hesitate, as if she was undecided about what to do next. The whispers that accompanied her were clearer, and Sarah could make out some words, like help and truth. The figure reached out towards Sarah, but instead of an icy sensation, she felt a wave of sadness and despair. It was then that she realized that the shadowy figure was not a threat, but rather a tormented presence, something that needed help. With renewed courage, Sarah reached out and touched the shadowy figure's hand. A series of images and emotions flooded her mind, revealing a deep and ancient secret that was linked to the train and that figure. Sarah now knew that the key to solving the mystery was inside the central carriage, and she was determined to discover the truth. With the shadowy figure's help, she was about to be plunged into a nightmare that would take her to unimaginable places and revelations that would change her forever. Sarah and the shadowy figure stood hand in hand in the train's center carriage, sharing an inexplicable connection that transcended words. Images and emotions flowed between them, revealing the haunting story behind the mystery surrounding the night train. Sarah saw glimpses of the past when the train was used to transport prisoners and condemned people. she saw tormented souls who had perished on board, victims of a terrible tragedy that had stained the train with suffering and despair. The shadowy figure was one of those souls, a person who had unjustly lost his life aboard the train. Her never-ending quest was for justice and redemption, a quest that had kept her trapped in the world of the living, unable to find peace. As the images unfolded before her eyes, Sarah understood the urgency of the shadowy figure's mission. She was determined to help her find redemption and free the tormented souls still roaming the train. Sarah realized that she needed to unravel the mystery of the tragedy that had occurred aboard the train and find a way to free the trapped souls. She knew the task would not be easy, but she was willing to face any challenge. The shadowy figure guided Sarah through the train, revealing hidden secrets and secret passages that led to the darkest places in the engine. Sarah saw terrifying visions of past events, witnessing the suffering of those who had perished. As they advanced, the dark whispers became clearer, as if the trapped souls were trying to communicate. They asked for help and cried out for redemption, their voices echoing through the empty hallways. Sarah eventually reached a hidden compartment where she found old documents and records of events that had occurred aboard the train. She discovered that a terrible tragedy had occurred there decades ago, when an accident had caused the deaths of dozens of prisoners and guards. The shadowy figure was one of the victims of the accident, a person who had been wrongfully convicted and now sought justice for those who had lost their lives on that fateful day. With the help of evidence found in the documents, Sarah and the shadowy figure devised a plan to free the tormented souls and ensure the truth about the accident was revealed to the world. They knew it wouldn't be easy, as there were dark and supernatural forces that guarded the train's secrets. Sarah and the shadowy figure's journey took them through dark hallways, narrow staircases, and abandoned compartments. They faced supernatural obstacles and challenges that tested their courage and determination. Finally, after facing a series of trials, they reached the heart of the mystery. There, they discovered a secret room that contained trapped souls, imprisoned by an evil force that prevented them from moving forward. With the help of the shadowy figure, Sarah confronted the evil entity and used the evidence they had found to uncover the truth about the accident. The trapped souls finally found peace and were released, their whispering voices disappearing. The night train stopped abruptly, as if the engine itself recognized the triumph of Sarah and the shadowy figure. The lights flickered and then went out completely. When the lights came back on, the shadowy figure stood before Sarah, a look of gratitude in his empty eyes. It slowly dissipated, disappearing into the shadows of the train. Sarah knew she had accomplished her mission and helped the shadowy figure find redemption. She found herself back in the center car, surrounded by the other passengers who were still asleep. The nighttime train journey continued without further supernatural incident, and Sarah finally reached her destination. She left the train with a sense of accomplishment and an understanding that some dark stories need to be told and some tormented souls need to be heard. She knew she would never forget her frightening journey on the night train, but she also knew that she had made a difference in the lives of the shadowy figure and the trapped souls. She had faced the unknown and emerged stronger, certain that truth and redemption were powerful forces capable of overcoming any obstacle.